far more credible will be some bilateral or trilateral military arrangements with Ukraine and potentially the West, whether that's America, the UK, France, Poland, other nations, that all of which deploy maybe semi-permanent forces into Ukraine so that an attack on Ukraine is an attack on those forces as well. And that would create a seed of doubt in President Putin's mind that would say that there's more to risk by going again than to gain. My worry, of course, in all of this is that we are heading towards some form of potential negotiation. If that happens, it's very difficult to see Russia not emerging from that with a 20% stake of territory from Ukraine, and he will sell it as a win. It will be seen as a win by China, North Korea, Iran, and that has incredibly difficult implications for our global national security. So I'm not entirely sure that peace talks which hand President Putin a win are going to be credible, but unfortunately, it does appear we're heading that way. Ultimately, though, it is up to President Zelensky to decide the future for Ukraine. It's just not looking good in terms of choices at the moment.
Also, European officials are urging Trump's administration to commit several thousand troops to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine in case of a ceasefire. According to Bloomberg, only American military presence will make this peacekeeping mission a credible one. What is your reaction to this? And do you believe that only US military presence will make this mission a credible one?
I think there are a couple of issues here, Daniel. I think American presence on the ground would be a very powerful deterrent for President Putin. Unfortunately, I don't think that's coherent with where President Trump's head is at the moment. I think he has been very critical of NATO. He's been very critical of nations within NATO that believe that they can just hide under the umbrella of security that NATO provides, but not pay their way. And therefore, he wants to encourage European NATO countries to step up, not only with money, but also military capability and equipment onto the ground. So I suspect he will not see Ukraine as an American problem. He will see this as a great example of a European challenge and will therefore be pushing very hard, not only for European countries to get involved and find a solution, but also use this as a catalyst to increase defense spending across Europe. You'll know that he's currently seeking 5% of GDP for NATO countries. It used to be NATO was setting a target of 2%, and there are still a third of NATO countries that fail to meet that low bar. If it goes up to 3, 4, or 5%, which is exactly what America is seeking to achieve, that will certainly provide the West with a more robust military deterrence. But whether those politicians have the appetite for that at the moment, we'll have to wait and see.
Let's cover also Vladimir Putin and Kremlin. Russian dictator Putin believes that he has achieved key objectives in the war against Ukraine, according to Reuters. However, Putin is frustrated about the state of Russia's economy. Meanwhile, Russian elite becoming more favorable to the peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine, according to the Reuters sources. Don't you think that these developments can indicate Russia's willingness to settle the war, to negotiate a ceasefire?
Daniel, that may be true, but it does feel more like hope than expectation. As we've said before, I think sanctions do have an impact on Russia's economy. There is no doubt that inflationary pressures are building. That with, I think it's about 30% of spending now on defense, that this is not a sustainable model for Russia. However, if I put myself in the leadership shoes of Putin, I would be pushing very hard at the moment so that when, not if, there is a negotiation, that he's in a very strong position. That's why I believe, even though it's winter, even though there's no undergrowth to hide behind, even though it's very difficult to dig trenches in the ground, and traditionally Russia has not been on the offensive in the winter, They have been pushing very hard this winter despite the losses. All of that appears to indicate that Russia is trying to get itself into as strong as possible position, ready for that negotiation. I think that's also coherent. If you remember, the Ukrainians did an invasion of Russia into the Kursk region. And although Ukraine has been pushed out of a good proportion of that enclave now, it still has a very credible military presence. And I think Putin has been pushing hard in the Donbass to try to force Ukraine to pull out its forces. And it's also been using North Korean forces in the Kursk region to try to bolster up the Russian effort. But Ukraine has held firm. It is still having a robust defense. And therefore, it looks likely, if we do end up with some sort of negotiation, that Ukraine's holding some of the territory in Russia might be a useful bargaining chip as well. But back to your central question, do we think that pressures building on Putin will force him to the table? I don't think so. Will they be an element, a factor? I have no doubt that he would like to see the war end. He does not know just how powerful his support is back in Russia, because he controls all of the media. But it's pretty clear that the oligarchs, the generals, where the real power lies, they cannot be happy with the way this war is going. They cannot be happy with the various sanctions, that they're not able to live their lives and enjoy their wealth. There's no doubt pressure is building on Putin, but whether that crack in the dam opens in the next day, week, months, or years, it's very difficult to tell.
Also, US President Donald Trump says that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants to make a deal, but Trump is not really confident about whether Putin would like to make a deal. From your perspective, why is there such focus on President Zelensky's willingness to settle the war, to make a deal?
I think we've got to be careful, Daniel, about the language here. You know, President Trump has made his fortune around doing deals. You're hired, you're fired. He's made his fortune in real estate, and he knows that a deal is to be done. That's what he puts his, and he's doing that with American foreign policy. He's doing that with a lot of the headlines that he's been grabbing and some of the orders that he's been signing in the first week of his time. What he's effectively saying is, this war isn't to anybody's benefit. We need to bring it to a close. The concern is that, of course, Trump will be simply concerned with having successfully ceased the war in Ukraine, having that on his CV. The problem is that if you don't resolve the underlying problems, in other words, create the security for Ukraine long term, make it clear that Putin is not rewarded for these ambitions, then the danger is, what next? We haven't even talked about Belarus, but that's another country in which Russia has been gradually seizing control of. It hasn't attacked militarily, but it's now got itself embedded in that country. And almost certainly that will be the next prize that President Putin will effectively seize. This is not the end of not the beginning of the end with Ukraine. It looks like the end of the beginning.
What would it take for US President Donald Trump to help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength?
I think that depends on what the position of strength is. I as a military guy, I don't believe sanctions are going to solve this. I think President Putin has to think that he will get badly damaged if he continues. And the only way to do that is to bring Western power to bear. Western air power will be the first obvious choice, because it would absolutely dominate Russia. Russia would not have an answer to that. And Ukraine has done it spectacularly well, but it's very difficult to fight a modern war without having air cover, which it doesn't have. So I do think that if President Trump really wants to get this war to an end and force President Putin to the table, military involvement is the way to do it. Whether he's prepared to threaten that or not, it'd be interesting to see what his advisors say. There's no appetite in America that I can see at the moment for getting involved in a war in Ukraine. But ultimately, the only language which President Putin understands is that of military threat. That is, it seems to me the West has to stand toe to toe with President Putin. Otherwise, he might stop because it suits him. But whether it actually stops him coming again, that's another matter.
So you're confident that only a no-fly zone will help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength?
I'm not saying that's the only way. I really hope that President Putin is brought to the table without having any force applied. But my worry is that if you look at it from a negotiating position, President Zelensky doesn't appear to have much to play on that negotiation, whereas President Putin seems to have most of the aces in his hand. And therefore, how do you create a bit more balance so that there is a meaningful negotiation where there are compromises on both sides and ultimately peace is secured? I don't see that happening without military engagement, and the no-fly zone is probably the least risk, but the most obvious benefit way to do that.
And what could be the most riskiest type of deployment to Ukraine from your perspective? If Donald Trump, for example, goes all in and says that he would like Ukraine to actually win this war?
I'm not sure that there's a risk. I mean, ultimately, the risk people keep talking about is the threat of starting nuclear war. And I'm very confident that that is not on the table. People forget I was in the military when we were in the Cold War. We lived under the threat of nuclear war. It's abhorrent. Nuclear weapons are dreadful. But their very existence means that it will be mutually assured destruction were anybody to use nuclear weapons. So I'm confident that Russia would have everything to lose and nothing to gain by triggering a nuclear war. What the West has to do is match Putin, stand toe to toe with him. And therefore, I think whilst it would undoubtedly cause frictions and escalations, I'm confident that unless you deal with people like Putin, very aggressively, then we will have this problem returning again. Just imagine other nuclear nations like Iran, like North Korea, when they get nuclear weapons, not if, when they do, if people aren't prepared to stand toe to toe with them, we are effectively saying that those countries can do what they like around the world. That is not a world in which I am comfortable at all. We need to be able to stand firm. We need to be able to stand up to bullies like Putin. And I think the only way to do that robustly is military engagement. I hope that is something that's on the table, because otherwise I worry that President Putin will pause, regenerate, and in a few years he'll be back again.
From your perspective, so even if the West enters the fight in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will not use any kind of nuclear weapons.
I think Putin will be absolutely stupid to trigger a nuclear war, which he knows he cannot win. Putin is all about his legacy. It's all about restoring Russian greatness again. If Russia starts something that ends up leveling Moscow and getting rid of his legacy, then his legacy will be absolutely awful. I'm very confident that he will do lots of threatening behavior, but the whole premise of nuclear weapons is neither side wins. President Putin is the one who has invaded Ukraine. President Putin is the one responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives being lost and for millions of people being relocated. We have allowed him the luxury of believing that he is not vulnerable to attack. We must correct that if we are to stop this happening in the future.
Let's cover also Russia's position in Syria. So according to the recent reports, Syria's new government has terminated Russia's 50-year lease for the Tartus naval base, forcing Russian Navy to evacuate its fleet and military personnel. What is your take on such developments, and how can this influence Russia's position around the globe and during the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, I mean, we haven't got time to go into the detail of Syria, but there is no doubt that Russian forces helped keep Assad in power for many, many years. The Russian Air Force particularly bombed a lot of the soldiers on the ground and therefore stopped them presenting a threat. Therefore, there'll be little love lost with the new administration in Syria, and no surprises that Russia has been thrown out. I think what was interesting is, of course, that the uprising happened at a time when also you've got the forces of Hezbollah that would normally have gone to the aid of Assad. They've been badly mauled with the fight with Israel as well. So it was a sort of case of opportunism, and it showed just how thinly that Russian forces are spread and how much that things can change very swiftly. Russia likes to cause mischief around the world, inciting uprisings just to cause issues around the world in support of their own agendas. I think this has been an interesting wake-up call for Russia, and it will be very keen, I suspect. It's another reason why they will want to end the war in Ukraine, at least in the near term, so they can consolidate, lick their wounds, and work out what they're going to do next.
Let's also cover the US foreign policy. Donald Trump is serious about taking control over Greenland. And according to Financial Times publication, there was a really interesting phone call between Trump and Prime Minister of Denmark. From a strategic point of view, would Greenland make US army, US power more stronger around the globe?
I think, Daniel, you have to look at its geography. The shortest distance between America and Russia goes over Greenland. And therefore, there is a military base, a US military base on Greenland that looks at early warning, provides early warning notification for Russian missiles coming over the pole there. In addition, though, there's a lot of natural resources in Greenland. And although Denmark effectively owns Greenland, the Greenlanders themselves, there's not many of them, couldn't really present a realistic defense if Russia, China, or somebody else decided to invade them. And that country is strategically important, not just for America, but for the security of the West. So much as I don't think that President Trump is going to invade, it does highlight just how important that region is. But you have to, I think, Daniel, we've talked about Trump a lot today. One of the things that I think he's very big on is rhetoric, not always so good at delivering. And I think another area where he talked about the Panama Canal and threatening that he was going to seize that potentially by military force. But if you look at the history of that canal, you know, it was initially started by France, but basically the project failed because it was so vast. America took it on, opened in 1914, and America ran it till 1977. And then they handed it over a period of 20 years for the Panamanian Canal Authority to run it. But of course, since then, the charges for going through that strait have risen. My understanding is the average charge for a ship is now $50,000. And President Trump has said, hold on a minute, we done that. We paid for it. We ran it. We gave it to you. And now you're charging us $50,000 for every crossing. And China is stepping in to help run it. No, we can't have that. And all he's doing is he's threatening to set the scenes for a negotiation. So I think a bit like Greenland, there's a lot of rhetoric around Trump. Let's just see how it gradually forms into policy, because it's one thing talking about it, it's quite another doing anything about it.
Also, some military experts suggest that obtaining Greenland for the US would be really beneficial, for example, for intercepting Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile in case of their launch. What is your take on that? Do you agree with such a logic?
Well, as I said, Daniel, you know, the US has a base on Greenland, and it's there to track missiles coming from Russia, because the shortest distance from Russia to America is over the top of Greenland. So we have seen a lot of Western nations haven't really focused on long-range ballistic missiles as a threat since the Cold War. But of course, Russia has been launching those into Ukraine regularly, and Iran has launched a whole load into Israel. And all of a sudden, that's heightened all nations' awareness of what's their ability to detect, track, and destroy these long-range weapons. I know I speak to you now from the United Kingdom. Although we have radar setups, we used to have missile systems like Bloodhound that were available to take out such missiles. Today, we don't have that defense because we haven't invested in it, because we haven't thought it's a realistic threat to our country. I think the attacks over the last couple of decades have demonstrated there's an increased threat to all of our nations, that we have to be aware that long-range ballistic missiles can cause a lot of damage, and therefore you need to have preparations, not only to detect them, but also track them and destroy them. And that is why areas like Greenland are so vital.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.
Yes, but we've got to be clear on both sides is what both sides want. There are big questions. One on Trump's side, which is absolutely clear, they're not his team. Marco Rubio, Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and General Kellogg, the special envoy in Ukraine. Whether they're completely in agreement about what they want, I get the impression, and I'm only working from open sources, that they're not on the same page yet. That they haven't got an agreed position. Now let's flip that over, and we can never really know with the secretiveness of that organization what is going on in the Kremlin. But there have been unofficial noises that there is real concern about how Russia and the Russian economy, and particularly the war economy, now depends on China. And it is fairly evident from some noises that we're getting through Telegram, through unofficial channels, that some fear in the Russian security apparatus that China is there to, as one Telegram source put it, to make Russia into a mineral and resource colony. China, which has enormous resources itself, as we know, is rapacious. In other words, grabbing all it can in terms of REE, rare earth elements. And by the way, the US is on much the same mission, and it will all come down to that. But as I said, the other thing that is so interesting is to see actually the state of the Russian economy. How can you keep up this enormous pressure to turn so much of economic, by that I mean fiscal and industrial effort, to the war, to the war, which is grinding on, but at a tremendous price. How many months that can go on? I think it'll be a few months more, but I think we're beginning to see the cracks already.
And do you expect a ceasefire deal on Ukraine to be reached until the end of this year?
I expect something. And why I'm so cautious with my words is I don't think it will be a resolution. I think they're going to find it, all parties are going to find it very difficult to get to a resolution, a position on which you can build. Because after all, we've got precedent here, which they keep citing, is, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. And it's amazing to see when you get pronouncements from Lavrov and from Putin's own office, from the more extravagant pronouncements from Medvedev, really they are bringing up the same terms of Minsk, of the Minsk agreement. It's a demilitarization to start with. That they've got stuck on that. What would be very interesting to see is how much Russian forces have the capacity to enforce the kind of deal that they seem to be looking for.
Also, let's cover recent statements from the Russian ally. Do you feel that the public opinion in Russia is also moving forward peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine? And also Reuters reported that Russian ally would like to see this war settled as soon as possible.
Well, the Russian allies, it's fairly clear through the Astana process, the CSTO, the Central State Treaty Organization, don't like providing cannon fodder, which is what they're there for. That this is Putin's appeal to them. Can you support me? And we've even had this from the recently re-elected, if I could put it like that, head of government, head of state in Belarus. That it is a drag on them, and they would like to see some settlement. I think particularly that with the fragility in the Caucasus, particularly, that they would like some kind of settlement. But Russia, the Putin hard center, really would like to do to Ukraine what it is already doing quite successfully in Georgia, but it's a completely different proposition. That is takeover by erosion. Ideally, in the Putin conspectus, in his cosmos, that really Ukraine would become very much like Belarus under Lukashenko, which is not going terribly well. There's still a very restive population in Belarus, that they would like to become some form of satellite. The bottom line with the Putin negotiation, is that what he really wants is to make it absolutely clear that Ukraine, along with Belarus, along with Moldova, along with the recalcitrant elements in the Caucasus, are part of the greater Russian sphere of influence and command. It's a very retro view. It almost belongs, so much with Putin, belongs to Tsarist Russia. With him as a Tsar, this sort of Russian, as the great writer Ryszard Kapuscinski would have put it, Russian imperium. But that looks more and more out of date as Russia threatens to fall behind so much, particularly in the technology of war. I mean, in a way, tactically, it's been outsmarted in a very curious and very disturbing way, it must be, for Russia, technically by Ukraine, and strategically, of course, by China. China is a senior partner now, and Russia is moving slowly, or not so slowly, from the status of a junior ally to being a client.
Also, North Korean troops have been pulled off of the front line in the Kursk region because of the high casualties rate. They have been redeployed out of the war zones there. What is your assessment of this development?
Well, I don't know, because I'm not there, and it's very difficult to calculate reports. But what I would say is that there has been a ferocious, in this very sad scenario, but to say there's something almost comical about the propaganda war about the North Koreans. Things have not gone well for them. Let that be said. It's not clear whether 8,000 or 11,000 were committed, and certainly a lot have been killed and injured. I think that the reports from British and American intelligence, working from surveillance and from open sources, that the casualty list is over 3,500, seems to me to be pretty clear. What is so terribly interesting is that very much sort of pro-Russian propaganda channels, and there's one that purports to come from the German Axel Springer publishing empire, that was pointing out that these are the elite troops. They were there to show the way of how the new ways of war would be done in North Korea. They would be there to help train Russians. I mean, where the imagination of the writer comes from is quite extraordinary. But the North Korean gamble by Putin's Kremlin seems to have caused an awful lot of trouble, and it seems from sources working in Shanghai and Beijing tell me it seems to have annoyed the Chinese hierarchy an enormous amount, giving such free play to the maverick regime in Pyongyang of Kim Jong-un.
Let's cover also another idea of sending European peacekeeping forces to Ukraine. President Zelensky says that there is a need for at least 200,000 troops, European troops in Ukraine, to properly enforce a ceasefire line in case if there would be such a deal. What is your take on that?
Well, it sounds that President Zelensky is playing Trump at his own game, isn't he? You know, when you make a deal, you bid up more numbers than you can possibly get, and you just see what happens. But where President Zelensky seems to really have hit the mark, if there is going to be a peace deal, if there's going to be a demarcation, and if it emerges as something like that between North and South Korea, in that frozen conflict, it really will need a lot of monitoring. A lot of it can be done by surveillance. A lot of it can be done with the assistance of AI models and so on. But this is where it is going to be a very difficult test, and where Trump has a very strong argument. This is in the interest of wider European security. You cannot expect it to be managed by the Americans, and it must be managed by European NATO partners who may be working through the EU defense arrangement, which is an embryonic, if you can do an embryonic recreation, it's an embryonic recreation of the old Western European Union. And it isn't very effective, frankly. The EU element, just to park that to one side, is not effective as long as you've got dissidents like Slovakia and above all Hungary saying they don't go along with this at all. But this is where it is a very big moment for NATO as well. And this will come up at the summit in The Hague on the 24th and the 25th of June. Because how much of its own affairs can the European alliance in NATO do? And this is the point. Trump talks numbers. You've got to up the expenditure in proportion to your GDP of anywhere between 3.5, as his advisors put it, to 5% of GDP. The 5% of GDP simply won't happen. But in fact, where he does have an argument, and this is where there's a great deal of difficulty, and it is very important for the prospects for future peace and stability in Ukraine, is what the European partners will do for themselves. And that is where you get great confusion at the top. The big three military powers in European NATO, Germany, France, and Britain, are bedeviled by political confusion. And I include my country. I very much include Britain in that, because the Starmer government simply does not seem to know what it wants with defense and security and resilience policy and strategy. And there's something culturally about them where they do not seem to understand how the utility of force, the projection of power, enforcing a foreign policy requires credible military. And there's so much at the moment which is simply incredible about Britain's military posture.
Also, let's cover Trump's threats to Panama and Greenland. Donald Trump says that the US will take control over Panama Canal and Greenland in diplomatic or even military way. He does not exclude deploying troops to this region. What do you make of this Trump's threats around the globe?
He hasn't got enough. He hasn't got enough troops to do all that he says that he might have to think of doing. Look, he can't do Greenland, and what do you do? I mean, they've got rights to 3 bases, a cluster of 3 bases there. What's he going to do? A major submarine base? He is very keen on a lot of these things. There's minerals and oil which make people very interested, particularly off the northeast of the great island of Greenland. But a lot of it, including Panama, is about area access defense denial. As you know, in the jargon, AA, DD. And he's got this obsession that China controls the Panama Canal. No, it doesn't. Chinese groups, Hong Kong-based, I believe, have an interest, quite a powerful interest, in 2 of the 5 ports. There are 4 major ports on the Panama Canal. So let's talk back there. He cannot confront Mexico and Canada, and it's not quite clear what he intends with Canada, occupy the canal zone of Panama, claim that America can take over Gaza, which is the latest thing, albeit temporarily, that's come up in the press conference, the news conference with Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington. It's simply not there, because it's very peculiar to say, even with a defense budget of well over $750 billion, something going north of $800 billion dollars. The forces are hollowed out. There are shortages of personnel in key areas. A lot of the procurement programs are completely jammed, particularly submarine building, for example. And right across the advanced Western powers, there is a problem with recruiting. Young men and women are more reluctant to put their lives on the line and go to the military. They are risk averse for all kinds of reasons. This brings us back to your question. Can Trump occupy Greenland or parts of Greenland, as he has threatened with the Danes, occupy Panama and take it back, and claim that he's got to help out Canada, and he's obsessed by this, because Canada and the alliance must keep a hold on at least and have a control of one of the major Arctic routes. This is really quite something. But having said that, if you'll just indulge me, the thing that we're learning here is that Trump does behave like a property dealer towards his allies. He's not very good with allies. He doesn't know how to schmooze friends. He seems really happier to schmooze people who are less than democratically underpinned, if I could put it like that, like Putin, even Xi to some extent, and Kim Jong-un. He seems to like dictators rather a lot, but he's got to bring on board a lot of the of his truly democratic allies. And there's an interesting thing to note. I'm fascinated in the whole story of the Arctic regions, which is a big area of contestation. He needs the Nordic powers, particularly the Norwegians, absolutely on side with him, as much as he needs the Danes, the Swedes, and the Finns. But the Norwegians, and I'll come back to why in a minute, and he needs Britain, by the way, very, very much in Antarctica, because that is another area of contestation where there is a quasi-military militarization that has been going on, particularly from Chile, Argentina, including China, that has its 5th major research station. It's got nothing to do with peaceful civil science so much. In its main intent, it's to do with space and space control and satellite control as much as anything terrestrial. And why Norway? Norway, proportionally, certainly, has the richest heritage fund going. Proportionately, it has as much clout as that of Saudi Arabia. And that's why Trump will need them, because what does he share with Britain, France, Italy, and a lot of his other allies is huge debt. And a lot of the debt, incidentally, in junk bonds is owed by China. So going back to the point about Arctic security, Norway can pay its way. Technically, it's extremely capable. It punches well above its weight in real terms and holds the key to the Arctic entrance into Europe for Russia and China. And that will come more and more to be on the agenda. It will go up the agenda steadily through his presidency.
I also have a follow-up question about Gaza. Recently, U.S. President Donald Trump said that he can take control over Gaza and be in charge of reconstruction of this region. He also does not exclude sending military troops to Gaza. Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, says that this is interesting idea. What is your reaction to the statement, and what could this mean for the entire region?
Well, it's wildly unrealistic, and it's very interesting reading the comments from the region. And I think that even the mild opposition in Israel is slightly startled at this, because America has been so reluctant to get in there. It's not had a good history. Remember going into Lebanon in 1958, and then in 1982 with an MNF, a multinational force. It ends with battleships bombarding the Shuf Mountains. In the end, it does not go well. The commitment would be enormous, and also if you transfer the Gaza population of about 2 million plus, how do you do it? How do you manage it? Particularly as the nominated countries, Egypt, Saudi to some extent, but Jordan, are so reluctant to receive an influx of Palestinians, and an enforced transfer is against international law as well established now. It's against the laws of humanitarian law. So we'll put that there. I think it was just again a developer's reaction. He's quite right, Trump, in saying that Gaza looks like a demolition site, and how you deal with it and manage it is going to be very, very difficult indeed. By the way, it will not be the Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean, because conditions, physical conditions, environmental conditions are extremely difficult. And the wiser Israelis have known this for years and years and years. The aquifers, the access to fresh water, the desertification, it is a huge problem, and it would depend on fresh water being brought in from the north, particularly through reverse osmosis and other processes from Israel. It requires a deal between Israel and the Palestinians. This is the bottom line, and that has been left vague. Any conclusion to the Gaza ceasefire ends up with a notion of the Palestinian state, but there being Palestinian statehood, which Netanyahu and his hard-right allies, Ben Gvir currently outside the coalition but threatening to come back in, and Smotrich, absolutely will not take. But what Trump has done with this press conference is that he has given Netanyahu a route to get re-elected. Okay, we can follow the American plan. And on the wilder edges, the wilder shores of this plan, the idea that you could push Palestinians out of Gaza and also suppress them and possibly even expel them from the occupied West Bank, or what the Israeli establishment like to call Judea and Samaria, is absolutely beyond imagination, and probably would provoke a wider Israel-Arab war.
Thank you, Mr. Fox, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Yes. Pleasure.